Today we'll be talking about adulthood, changes in your parents. Hopefully, by the end of going through this PowerPoint today, you'll have an appreciation for your parents and everything they have to go through in their aging process. All right, so first we're going to talk about the stages of adulthood, right? The social development. So these are Eric Erickson's stages of development. Remember we talked about he had those 8 stages. These are the last 4 stages. So emerging adulthood. This is a period in late teens to early 20s. Has not fully accepted adult responsibilities yet, right? So, think about, going off to college. You're starting to become an adult, but really, you really haven't been taking those full responsibilities. Young adulthood, 20 to 40. This is, if you remember, the intimacy versus isolation, struggle to form close relationships, or you feel isolated. So if you remember Eric Erickson, you have the positive and the negative side, and it isn't necessarily good or bad, right? So intimacy versus isolation. Intimacy would be, you're ready for that relationship. Isolation, you're not. Notice this is a young adulthood, right? So those 20s to 40s, where I find myself in. The emerging adulthood, where, that's the identity versus role confusion. You're trying to figure out who you are. Then you get to the middle adulthood, right? The 40s to 60s, the generativity versus stagnation, right? So concern for contributing to the world, like family and work, or you feel, or they feel they lack purpose, right? So you start to look back in your 40s and 60s, and like, did you contribute anything? Did you do anything positive for the world? And it could just be through your work, it could be through your family, or you feel like your life kind of lacked purpose a little bit. And then the last stage, the late adulthood, this is 60s and up, until they die, is integrity or ego integrity versus despair. This is where you reflect on his or her life to have a sense of satisfaction, integrity, or a sense of failure, which would be despair. All right, so that's the social development part of adulthood. Finding a mate. All right, so the average ages of first marriage. So 1960, men were 22, women were 20. By 1990, men were 26, women were 23. By 2017, men were 29 and a half, women were 27.4. In 2017, only up half a year since 2013. So it hadn't, in the last 4 years, it really hadn't moved much, and that's pretty much where it is now. Why do you think the age of men and women, especially, has gone up? Think about this. What has changed in the last 50, 60 years? I mean, there's a couple of things you could say. One is you have more women getting education, more women in their workforce. You have people living longer. So one of the biggest things is with women in the workforce, that's their concentration, not necessarily getting married. Where before, even when women went to college, for a lot of women, their purpose was just to find a husband. That's not the case anymore, right? They have careers, and that's one of the things why when people have left children, the best way to control births is actually to have to educate women, right? So it's not the one-child policy or anything like that. It's actually education. So women who have a career, they're not going to worry about children, and they will prevent themselves having children to focus on their career till they're later and they're more established in their career, because it's not that hard not to have children. Also, it says couples that live together before marriage are less satisfied in their marriage and more likely to get a divorce. I don't know if I 100% agree with that. I know, me personally, I'd want to know what I'm getting into before I marry someone. But you have to think about what type of person tends not to live together before they're married also. Maybe they're more religious, so maybe they don't believe in divorce also. So there's other things that could go into that. Over here in the box, it says the number of single Americans living with their significant other was 18 million in 2016. So according to the Pew Research Center, that's a 29% rise since 2007. While you might be in a long-term committed relationship, there's less of a rush towards marriage and kids. So part of it is just culture nowadays. People aren't getting married. So the millennial generation, right? They're in their 30s now. They're waiting to get married. Um, they're not in a rush to get married, and that's just it's more of a cultural thing and an age thing right now. Also, parenting. The birth of the first child is a major turning point in a marriage, and I can definitely testify to this. Right, marital satisfaction can decline with children. Taking care of a child is a lot of work. It's very stressful, and then the more children you have, the more stressful it is. So you can see a decline in marital satisfaction because you're so busy with the children, you might not have time for each other. And so that's one of the very important things with a marriage is you always have to take care of yourself because if you don't take care of yourself, now that's going to reflect on your children, right? So if you're not happy, that's going to reflect on your mood and what happens with your children. So you got to take care of yourself. So parents, it's important and it's hard to do sometimes is to set aside time for yourself. Sometimes people think that's selfish, but really it's not because if once again, if you're not well, that's going to affect all parts of your life. And so we tend to see when kids leave home, when they go off to college, parents often find a renewed satisfaction in their marriage, right? Because they don't have the burden of children around anymore. And even though we love our children, sometimes they can be a burden. Physical changes in adulthood. One of the things is menopause, right? So usually for women, it starts in the late 40s. And what menopause is the ending of their menstrual cycle. Some of the things that happen during menopause is rapid hormonal changes. And so some of the symptoms include hot flashes, mood swings, and decalcification of the bones. That's why a lot of women, as they get older, their doctors often recommend that they have calcium to keep their bones strong. And there's other things you can do as well to help this. One thing you can do is work out, especially strength training. Um, so one of the things is if you, as you're working out, you do like slow reps. That helps build strong bones. Also, physical changes in older adults. Some of the things we tend to see could be maybe your hair starts to change. It becomes gray or white. Maybe you start to get wrinkles in your skin. Maybe you start to lose vision. Maybe you start to have some hearing loss. And this is different for everyone. Sometimes some people it happens earlier than other people. A lot of it depends on how the environment you find yourself in and how you treat your body. Vision loss is going to happen with age, especially with reading. They say when you get in your 40s, everyone will need reading glasses. Hearing loss, that's especially with frequency. The older you get, you can't hear in high frequencies. There's also something called male menopause, right? So we know female menopause, where the menstrual cycle stops. Well, male menopause is where you have a gradual depletion of testosterone. Right, so as you get older, you don't produce as much testosterone. You might have seen a lot of the advertisements for eugenics and things like that with the old White Sox player Frank Thomas, where they're promoting these new supplements now to especially males to keep their testosterone so they can stay as active as they once were when they were younger. Life expectancy. Elderly are more afraid of the process of dying than they are of death. Right? So especially if they're in that satisfaction stage, death doesn't necessarily scare them as much if they feel like they've lived a satisfying life. It's the process that really scares them, right? It's their mind and their body just not being able to do what they once could, right? They don't want other people to take care of them. So it's that process. They say you're born in diapers and you die in diapers. A lot of people, that's what they're scared of. That's what they don't want to have happen. So life expectancy in 1950, it was only 49 years old, right? That's not that long ago. People weren't living that long. In 1995, it was 67 years. And so that's why I remember it when I was in I remember reading some stuff when I was in high school, which was after that. But I remember seeing that age. I'm like, that's not actually that old. By 2007, it was up to 78 years. In 2011, the U.S. was 78.7, so it hadn't increased that much, which is only 26 in the world. We talk about all the technology and stuff we have in the U.S., but yet we're only 26 in the world with life expectancy. The world average is 80.1. U.S. men tend to live to be 76, U.S. women 81. The world leader is Switzerland, and this does change somewhat frequently. But the top countries usually stay, in the top few. So the world leader is Switzerland at 82.8. And so there's actually a website you can change, or you can check out. I have links to on the PowerPoint, and you can see what it is now. All right, so the U.S. average is actually going down, which is sad right now, and that's one of the reasons is because of opiate use. So many people are dying of opiates. We're talking about like heroin and things like that. Crocodile, which is a derivative of it, is, it's such an epidemic. Meth, things like that, that people are actually, the average age of the whole country is going down because so many people are dying of this. So it's really, an epidemic happening in the U.S. right now. And of course, you have pandemics, diseases, and things like that that are causing people to die. But overall, before, the recent years of the U.S. actually going down, why do you think, the age has increased so much? So hopefully you thought of some answers in your head. Some answers could be technology, right? That's a big thing. We are able to, identify the problems that we weren't being able to identify before, and then fix them with modern, medication and things like that. Hopefully we've, learned some things about how to live longer. Um, you know, my generation was supposedly going to be the first generation not to live as long as our parents, and that was because of how unhealthy we ate. So especially in the last like 10 years or so, you've seen a change in diets. You see like organic foods. You're trying to get away from that processed foods because we're so unhealthy. The U.S. is the world's most overweight and obese country because of all the processed foods that we eat. And talking to people from other countries, even fast food, they're like, oh, yours in the U.S. is just so greasy compared to theirs, even though it's fast food. It just doesn't have that grease and that process in it, because they have more regulations than we do. And so that's one of the reasons my generation was supposed to be the first not to live as long as my parents. We'll see now that there's been a change. We'll see what happens with that. One of the things you see is with countries that live a long time is these areas called blue zones. And there's some in the U.S. and throughout the world. I know Japan has an area. And what they do, they look at these like towns in these areas where they have a lot of people living to be at least 100 years, and they see what do they all have in common. And so it's something I'm always fascinated by. I should study it more. I've looked a little bit into it. I always remember the one thing they have in common. There's been a couple different books written about this. The one I always remember is like fish, right? So a lot of people, they tend to eat a lot of fish, these communities that tend to live a long time. But if you're interested in that, it's something to study. It's called Blue Zones, and you can just see what all these common factors are. Now, just because you do these things doesn't mean you're live to be 100, but they have a high percentage, and it's because of these common factors that they have. So lastly, cognitive abilities of the elderly. You do see a decline in memory and a decline in math as they get older. Long-term memory stays, but just have difficulty retrieving the information. So there is no limitations to long-term memory. We'll do a whole unit on this. There's no limitations. You can fit as much information in there as possible. But the older you get, there's a lot of stuff in there, and it might be harder to retrieve, right? And harder to remember certain things. There are two vocab words you need to know: crystallized intelligence and fluid intelligence. So crystallized intelligence is the accumulated knowledge and verbal skills. So as you get older, this actually increases. So the older you get, the more knowledge you can accumulate, you can gain. But fluid intelligence decreases with age. That's the ability to reason speedily and abstractly. So as you get older, you can't think as quickly as you once did, right? Your brain doesn't process as fast as it did. And this also deals with math skills, right? So that's one of the reasons why your math skills decline with age is because your fluid intelligence decreases with age. All right, so make sure you know crystallized intelligence and fluid intelligence. You will see this a couple times throughout the year. Make sure, obviously, it's both intelligence. Make sure you know the difference. Crystallized is gaining knowledge, right? So that increases with time. Fluid intelligence decreases with age because that's how quickly and abstractly you can think.